Good morning. I'm Lisa Combs, and today we're going to be talking about something called the Goldilocks Zone. Now, I want to kind of say right up front that every teacher out there knows that there is nothing new under the sun. We've all are used to going to trainings and walking away going, "Hey, I knew that already." And that's going to be probably the case with this training today. There may not be anything that I talk about today that is going to be brand new, like I've never heard this before. But hopefully, what it will do is maybe tickle your brain to remember some of those strategies that we've all used at one time and maybe have fallen out of the habit of, or just haven't thought to use in a while. And our topic today is going to be called the Goldilocks Zone. The Goldilocks story, if you'll all remember from your own childhood or reading to your own children or grandchildren, is that this little girl visits the cottage in the woods and ends up trying all three bowls of porridge before she finds the one that's just right for her. And the same with the chairs and the same with the beds. And so what we're going to be doing today is talking about how we get our kids in the just right zone for instruction. And so again, many of the strategies that I talk about might not be brand new to you, but they may be things that you haven't thought about for a while, or you haven't tried in a while, or you've just fallen out of the habit of using in your day-to-day instruction. So hopefully today you'll be re-energized to try some strategies to get your students in the Goldilocks zone. And with that, I'll share my screen and we'll get rolling. And we'll be together for this for about an hour, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. So our point in addressing this issue is that nothing that I need to tell you about. It's the fact that all of us are confronted with the challenge of having students that are in very different levels, either motivationally, readiness-wise, engagement-wise. We have kids that are all over the map, and never more so than in this time when we've got kids that some have been in virtual instruction, some are coming back to classroom instruction, some of us are working in hybrid situations, and it creates a situation where oftentimes we have kids in a classroom who have very greatly differing needs. And so how do we keep all of those kids in the just right zone for learning? And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's all based on something called the zone of proximal development. And that probably is already saying to you, hey, I remember that term from somewhere in my undergrad or sometime in grad school. I remember talking about that term, zone of proximal development. And the Goldilocks zone is just an informal way to remember the zone of proximal development because it is all about getting in the just right zone. But what it is, it's basically a kind of a instructional pedagogy that was developed by Lev Vygotsky a long, long time ago in the early part of the 20th century. But it's one of those instructional pedagogy concepts that is just as relevant today as it was when it was originally coined. So the zone of proximal development really refers to that difference between what a learner can do all by themselves independently, what they can do but need some guidance and direct instruction for, or the instructional level, and then what is really outside of even the realm of where that child is for readiness to be introduced to a concept, which would be more like the frustration zone. So the term proximal, for those of you who are vocabulary geeks like me, really is referring to nearness. So we're referring to skills that a learner is close to mastering, but needs that little instructional guidance and shove to get there. And that's where we want our kids to be for good learning. We don't want them to be in an independent level where things are too easy for them and we're not really challenging them and getting growth. But we also don't want them to be in the frustration zone where the concepts are so far beyond their grasp that they get frustrated, shut down, can't even connect what they're being presented to something that they previously knew. So that zone of proximal development is the area where we want to really focus on. So I always say, you know, a good example of that in our real life that I think many of us can relate to is that many of you might have at some point in your life been runners for fitness or fun. Maybe you were on the track team. Maybe you just ran for fitness, etc. I that's not my bag. Okay. I've never really done that. So if you and I were both put in a situation where a coach was going to try to grow our skill as a runner, you and I, if you've already been a runner before or have been running for fitness or leisure, you're going to be in a different zone of proximal development than me. So maybe you've been running 2 miles every day or 3 times a week for several years. I haven't been running at all. And maybe our goal of our coach, the shared goal we have, is for everyone to be able to run 5 miles within a certain time limit. When that coach begins to work with you and with me, he can't start at the same place, because if he starts at my level, we're all going to be walking at a pretty good clip for a mile this week. And that is not going to help you grow as an athlete, because you're already running 2 miles easily within that time limit. But if he tries to start me where you are, I'm going to be laying on the ground gasping for air, coming up with excuses not to come to practice tomorrow, maybe getting a doctor's excuse that says my knee is not good and I can't run. So, or I may just plug along at what I think I can do, but I'm never really growing my skills. And so a really good coach knows how to get that athlete into that zone of proximal development where I'm going to push you a little farther than you're comfortable with, but I know you can do it. And that's going to help you grow your muscles and your endurance, right? We are all really familiar with that from a physical development standpoint. That's easy for us to comprehend. So all we need to do then is take that same concept and apply it, because it's just as true, to growing in academic skills and behavioral skills for that matter. So today we're really going to talk about what strategies can we use as coaches of our kids to help them grow each time that they come to practice with us in our classroom. And that's what we'll be doing today. So here's a nice little kind of diagram that, if you're a visual person, shows the zone of proximal development concept in more of a visual format. So this target zone is what I can do already, what I'm already comfortable with, what I've already mastered. That purple zone is the zone of proximal development, or the Goldilocks zone. That's what I can do with some help and direct instruction. And then that blue zone outside, on the outside circle, is what I can't do. I'm not ready for it. I don't have the skills to do it. So we really have to have that understanding of those 3 circles in order to get our kids in that Goldilocks zone for learning. And obviously, to do that, we have to have some basis for it, right? So, these are just some examples, and I know many of you use many of these strategies already, but I think sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for the fact that we're doing formative assessment, because formative assessment is really important in establishing the zone of proximal development, or the Goldilocks zone. And a lot of us, when we hear the word formative assessment, are like, no, thank you. I spend enough time assessing my kids as it is. And I'm not talking, when I say formative assessment, I'm not talking about, actually sitting kids down for 20 minutes of a standardized test. That's not what I mean by formative assessment at all. What I mean by formative assessment are those informal ways that you kind of take the temperature of the learning in your room. Things like entrance and exit tickets, or KWL charts, or keeping a parking lot where, as kids have questions, they can write them on a Post-it note and walk over and stick them on the parking lot to be answered at a later time. Or a T-chart where you are starting a lesson by comparing what we know about this subject and what we don't know about this subject. A 3-2-1 where you're asking kids to list 3 things they already know about the subject, 2 things that they want to know and 1 thing that they don't understand, or however you want to assign the topics of the 3-2-1. They're quick, they're informal, but they're a way for you to take the temperature at any given time of what the level of understanding of your students is, and how much diversity there is in your classroom in terms of what they understand and how they understand what you've taught so far. These little strategies can really make a very big difference in helping you understand that I've got 4 or 5 kids in here who already know more about this subject than I was planning to introduce this week. And what am I going to do to keep them engaged and growing while I introduce that topic to the 3 or 4 kids who really don't even have the prerequisite skills to dive into this topic? And then what am I going to do for the majority of those kids who are right in that just right zone for the content I was planning to teach? So many times we're planning a lesson based on the Goldilocks zone for the majority of our students. And that's what we teach, and that's how we teach it. And sometimes the kids on the upper end who already knew more about it than you were even planning to teach, they're not in their Goldilocks zone for that entire week. Or maybe there's 3 or 4 kids who are so far out in that purple zone or blue zone on the outside of that ring that we talked about, that they are not even close to ready to learn it. And so using those formative assessment, informal formative assessment on a daily, multiple times a day basis really forms the foundation of how you're going to make sure that you are able to design your instruction in a way that every one of those kids remains in the Goldilocks zone. So, you can see some of the other things that I've jotted up there that you're familiar with. Popsicle stick to just pull out and call on kids, because I know all of us, and me included, I'm in classrooms every day as an instructional coach. But I was just as bad about this when I was a teacher. It was something that I was always working on, is that I tended to call on the same kids all the time. And so it sometimes gave me, because those were the kids that were volunteering, right? Well, who do you think are the kids that are volunteering in your class? They're the kids that are in the Goldilocks zone. They're the kids who your instruction is in that just right zone for. So they are able to engage and participate, and they're motivated to do so. And they're confident that they can do it because you have them in the right zone. But sometimes what that does is it gives us as a teacher a false impression that our instruction is hitting the target, because the only kids that are volunteering are the kids that are in the right zone. So the kids who are, maybe have already long ago mastered this content have checked out, and they're not participating. The kids who are not even close to ready for that content are throwing paper wads or poking their neighbor or put their head on their arms and are totally checked out or running out of the classroom. So sometimes we need to be reminded to use a simple strategy, just like pulling popsicle sticks at random, to call on students to answer, so that it's really giving us a more well-rounded perspective of what the temperature is of our classroom. Exit tickets, using the whiteboards to have students hold up responses so you can scan, even using technology like Kahoot or Quizlet to, do a quick little quiz and get some feedback. And that you can display on the whiteboard and those can be anonymous, but it gives you an idea that, about half of our class didn't get that right answer. I need to go over that one more time. Having kids go to the 4 corners of the classroom to represent answer A, B, C, or D, to do a quick, and that's a movement break as well for kids. So just thinking about rebooting some of those formative assessment strategies is your best bet for getting kids in the Goldilocks zone. And I think a lot of times we think these are elementary school strategies. These can be used absolutely at middle and high school. And I see it used all the time effectively. So please don't discount them. There are a million other strategies to try. I did jot down a link for you, but if you look up the NWEA site, they have a formative assessment archive that has a million other strategies. So if these don't appeal to you for whatever reason, or you're already using them and you want to add to your strategies, visit that formative assessment archive, and you can get a bazillion strategies that are going to be really useful for you. And I really encourage you not to gloss over this aspect of differentiating your instruction. You can't differentiate instruction if you don't know what zone your kids are in. So formative assessment is key for that. after you have formatively assessed and you know what your learners are, what zones they are in, just informally again, we're not talking about doing a standardized test and making charts and graphs. So I know a lot of people are like, if you tell me to collect data, I'm going to turn this off right now, because I know that we're all overwhelmed with assessment and data, and that can get a little bit repetitive and overwhelming to be told that. But I'm not talking about formal assessment. I'm not talking about taking up class time with more testing and data analysis, but I'm talking about quick, easy assessment that can just give you that in the moment reality check for what zones your kids are in. After you've done that, then you're able to say, how do I want to group these kids in a way that's going to make sure that I'm able to provide instructional activities designed for each group that is going to keep them in that Goldilocks zone. So flexible being the key term here, that you don't want kids to be tracked as here's my low kids, here's my high kids, because in any given setting and on any given topic, we are all in different zones of proximal development, depending on our background knowledge, depending on our prior instruction, depending on where we've having been instructed at. If we've been in another district that didn't cover the topic in the same order, the scope and sequence as our class in this particular district does, that can influence whether I'm in the right Goldilocks zone. Even trauma and my family circumstances can really impact that. So a lot of different things can impact my Goldilocks zone differently for different topics. So we want to make sure that our grouping is flexible and that we're doing formative assessment to decide for this topic, for this lesson, for this day, A, B, C, D students are in the same Goldilocks zone, but they might not be for a different topic tomorrow. Or a different part of the same topic tomorrow. That's why that formative assessment is the linchpin for all of this to work. Once you know that, and you know that I'm gonna really need to move my kids around in different formations on different days for different purposes, it gives you almost unlimited power to keep your kids in the right Goldilocks zone. So again, going back to, our athletics analogy, when my children were little and they went to baseball practice, some of the kids on their team had dads who played baseball in all the way from little league through high school and maybe even beyond. And those kids came to their first baseball practice with different skill levels than my children, who had never, ever practiced or learned anything about baseball. So the minute they got those kids together, they did some activities so that the coaches could assess what kinds of skills do we have in here. And then they would divide up, and different coaches would take different groups of kids to work on different skills. And they tried to sometimes they had those kids in groups that had the same need. So maybe we had kids who kept jumping out of the batter's box because they had never had a ball thrown to them. And they would be working on, helping those children get comfortable with having the ball tossed to them. But there might be a different group that was working on, different pitches, or working on their running skills. Depending on what their need was, coaches would divide and do different activities with those students and with those athletes. And that makes complete sense to us, doesn't it? We wouldn't expect that the entire practice would be spent as a whole group when we have different levels of skill. But there would be times when the coaches would get the whole team together, or make small groups that were heterogeneous in skill level so that they could work on the same skill with everybody, but in smaller groups. So coaches do this kind of naturally. Remind yourself every day that you're an academic coach. You are a person who is coaching kids on academic skills. So you have to use those same kinds of strategies that a coach would use personally training you or helping you develop your skills in a sport. So you might be grouping on readiness level, just like the kids on the baseball team. Maybe there's a group of kids that's never even touched a baseball and a glove. They're going to be working on a different skill level than kids who have been playing in the backyard with their dad pitching balls to them for 3 years before they ever hit the field. So sometimes we will be working in flexible groups grouped based on our readiness for a particular skill. But sometimes we might decide to group on by different learning modalities. So if we think there's a group of kids who aren't very strong readers and they need to learn some content about a science concept or a social studies concept, maybe they're going to work in a group where they're getting the information through their ears instead of their eyes, because reading is not their strength. And reading is such a high task demand for them that it's hard for them to actually decode and comprehend at the same time. So they might not need to have that information delivered through, electronic book that they can listen to, or by having a teacher or a paraprofessional read it out loud. But there might be another group of kids that needs to do more of a hands-on activity. They're antsy, they're squirrely, they need to be busy with their hands. And so there's something that's designed to keep them engaged. So we can also group based on learning modality. Another way that we can group that a lot of people forget about is by student choice or by student interest. So, if there's a particular topic that we're studying, like the pioneers or the space race or whatever topic you can choose as an example, you can design several different areas of exploration and then let the students choose which topic that they want to be a part of the expert group on. And that is a way to kind of provide them some interest and choice in their group. So groups can be student-led, they can be teacher-led, they can be student-selected who they're going to work with, or they can be teacher-assigned. And they can be short-term for just today's activity or part of a day's activity, or they can be for a longer-term project that we're going to work on together as a group. So flexible grouping, so formative assessment, we said is your linchpin for keeping kids in the right zone. But your other real powerful tool is flexible grouping, and understanding that that is one of the major tools you're going to use to make sure that your kids are staying in the right zone, because then you're able to design different activities and different instruction for those groups. And I know that immediately there's many of you who are going, yeah, that sounds really great. That is not as easy to do as it sounds. And that there are some challenges with that. There's no question that a differentiated classroom that has all the kids in the right Goldilocks zone looks different, is planned differently, is managed differently than a classroom where the majority of learning is taking place in a whole group at the same pace. There's no question about that. So you're not getting any argument from me. Is it easier to teach to the whole group? Yes. Is it more effective? No. So you really have to recognize that, yes, it requires effort, but the bang for your buck in terms of instructional outcomes is enormous. Once you start learning to use formative assessment, short, quick formative assessment, and flexible grouping based on that assessment, everything changes. So the next strategy that we're going to talk about that's really critical to a differentiated classroom or getting kids in the Goldilocks zone is called scaffolding. So scaffolding, what we usually think of as scaffolding are those structures that are built around a building that's going up to support that building while it's being constructed. That's a great way to remember what instructional scaffolding is. It's the supports that you put around a child while you're building up their learning. And then you start removing that scaffolding as they don't need it anymore, as they become more independently mastered in the skills that you've been instructing. So scaffolding is just strategies for supporting kids in learning until they're independent with those newly growing or being constructed skills. So we're going to go over what some of those are, even though I know you're looking at this list and you're going, yeah, I know I need to use visuals. Yes, I use think alouds. Yes, I use graphic organizers. We're going to go through some of those just as a reminder, a tickler of why those should be present in every classroom all the time. So the first thing that we talked about was scaffolding's definition, and I kind of gave you that image of the scaffolding around a building as it's going up. some things to remember about scaffolding is it's the assistance that's provided proactively to kids based on anticipated difficulties. So a lot of times one of the things that like I said, I know a lot of us were looking at those that previous slide and saying, yeah, I use all of those. But part of the problem is that oftentimes we're not doing it proactively. We're doing it in response to kids who didn't get it the first time. And that's part of the reason why it feels like extra effort to us, because it takes us off our track. It takes us off our game. We're feeling like we're having to backtrack or Band-Aid kids that didn't get it the first time. But what you want to remember is for scaffolding to really work to its best potential, it should be applied proactively. Should be something that we're thinking about when we're designing our instruction to begin with, not going back and doing as remedial. We may need to do that sometimes, but we need to anticipate difficulties. And that's what that whole formative assessment is about. It's to help us go, yeah, I could tell from that think, pair, share that we did as I walked around and listened to the conversations happening. I've got about 30% roughly of my kids who just don't have the prior background knowledge to really be ready for what I was planning to instruct today. So we anticipate, here's some things that they're going to struggle with today. And I know a lot of this has to be very on the fly. That's part of the art of teaching, right? Is being able to walk around, listen to that think, pair, share, and go, yeah, I've got about 30% of the kids who don't really even understand the vocabulary that I was using to introduce this lesson. So I'm going to have to backtrack and pre-teach vocabulary. That's the art of teaching. This is where I get so excited, because this is the powerful part. This is where we figure out, based on that informal formative assessment, how we're going to anticipate what our kids are going to be challenged with and how we're going to apply some of these scaffolding strategies. So there's supports that we provide to the learners until they're independent with the content, with the tasks, with the materials. And so in the beginning, just like with a building that's going up in the city, there's going to be a lot of scaffolding around our students. And as they become more comfortable with the content, more independent with the skills we're asking them to do, we're removing that scaffolding until they can do it all by themselves. So we might be using systematic prompts and cues and differing materials and differing instructional approaches to build and support that learning. And then we kind of pull those supports away until the child gains fluency and independence with skills. That's also sometimes known as gradual release of responsibility. And we'll talk about that in more detail in just a few moments. But it's all of the scaffolding is intended to put this child into the zone of proximal development, or the Goldilocks zone that we're teaching in. So let's go back just for a moment and go into just review a couple of those strategies, in case you're not as familiar with them. So visual supports, incredibly important. Most kids, every type of learner, so you're all familiar with the fact that kids can be auditory learners, visual learners, or hands-on learners. We all have our own preferences. But the cool thing about visual supports is that it enhances all other types of learning, because it remains present even after the learning activity has ended. So that's why you guys will have a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, because you can listen to me, but once my words are out of the ethers here, the visual allows you to refer back to it and remember key points. So visuals are really critical. Think alouds, where you are letting the child into your brain to hear how you approach that 3-digit subtraction problem with regrouping. And you think out loud as you're modeling the steps on the board, allows your students to get a glimpse into your metacognition. It's modeling metacognition for them. So thinking aloud through the steps of something, or maybe as you're reading a novel aloud, letting the students into your thought process and stopping and pausing to say, that makes me really curious about what in her life experience, what this character experienced that would make her react that way. That's an example of a think aloud where you're modeling for the child how to think about the text that you're reading. Using gestures and cues, using graphic organizers, helping connect to background knowledge so that kids who maybe are coming in with less experience or exposure to a concept get up to the same speed. Doing that partner practice and partner talk is really important, and pre-teaching the vocabulary you're going to use. Questioning, those are all great examples of scaffolding, and we'll go into more detail on each of those, but I kind of wanted to make sure we hit on each of them before we went much further. So we talked about formative assessment. We talked about flexible grouping. We talked about how important scaffolding is. Another key concept is how to use positive momentum. So most of us have had the experience before where you wake up and you know how much you have to get done in a given day, and you're totally overwhelmed by it. And so you sit down with your to-do list and you're sipping your coffee and you kind of look at through the list and you pick something to do that doesn't sound totally overwhelming. So you can just get it done and check it off the list. That's an example of positive momentum, because we know about people that they're more likely to stay engaged and try the next activity if they've been somewhat successful with the first activity. You're more likely to get a yes, a second yes, when you've gotten the first yes. So I always give this example of positive momentum and how marketers use it. A couple of years ago when Game of Thrones was the big show that everyone wanted to watch, I didn't have HBO, and I always felt like I was out of the loop when everyone was talking about Game of Thrones. I really wanted to watch it, but I didn't want to pay for HBO. So the cable company calls me one day and says, we've got this great special for a free trial of HBO just in time for Game of Thrones. No obligation. Would you like to try it? And I said, absolutely, sure. So they got my first yes, right? And while they're signing me up for that on the phone and explaining the terms of it, they say, while I've got you on the phone, would you like to hear about the deal we have going on higher speed internet access for you? Now, I didn't end up getting that, but the point is they had been trained to offer something that's really highly appealing and doesn't require anything from me. It doesn't require me to pay additional for that service. It's a free trial, very low risk, very appealing, highly motivating. The timing of it was perfect, okay? They know that offering me that golden apple coming down from the tree is going to make it more likely that I'll at least listen and stay engaged to the thing they really want to sell me, okay? Marketing 101. I majored in marketing before I switched to education. And that was in the very first class. The only marketing class I took was that concept, because it's so fundamental. You offer something appealing, low risk, low investment to engage someone before you ask more of them, okay? So that's the concept behind positive momentum, that we want to connect first with something that child already knows and has experienced and is confident with. That's why we want to do maybe a warm-up activity with a skill that that child has already mastered before we dive into more challenging content. We want to maybe sometimes begin with something highly preferred or of high interest. That's that anticipatory set, the hook, something by showing a YouTube video that's going to get them engaged and laughing. We may need to provide more positive feedback at the beginning of something. Give them something, a softball question that you can go, whoa, great job, before you dive into the more challenging content. So that's the concept of positive momentum. Cannot be overemphasized. So along with formative assessment, flexible grouping, scaffolding, positive momentum is another really critical concept to getting kids in the Goldilocks zone. Another really important aspect that's related to positive momentum is ending on success. So again, this is not a high-tech strategy that you have to go to a full-day training on. This is something you know intuitively, but doing it with intentionality can change the game in your classroom. So by ending on success, we set kids up for feeling like, yes, I got it. and it keeps them in that engaged in that Goldilocks zone. So if we cannot end on success, we're not in the Goldilocks zone. If we've got a child that we can't get to an end point where they got it, then they weren't in the Goldilocks zone. They were in that outer zone of, I wasn't ready for this yet. Okay. So we always want to end a lesson for students on success, so that to do that, we need to chunk instruction into smaller segments. Because when we attack a lesson, a unit, in too big a bite, there may be things along the way that were not in my Goldilocks zone. And you're going to lose me. And so when we chunk in smaller chunks, we're better able to recognize when things are going off course and stop and go, I need to redo with this kiddo. I need to do a short vocabulary lesson with this group of kids. I need to do a few more practice problems with these 3 kids before I ask them to move on. So that we decrease the likelihood that we're pushing a kid through at a different level than he's ready for. So that allows us to monitor our kids for growing frustration as well. I often say that some of the best teachers I know are teachers with a really good smoke detectors. So smoke detectors are what I refer to, what the term I use for those subtle signs kids give you that they're getting frustrated. Huffing and puffing. This is stupid. I hate math. Shoving their papers, crumpling papers up, stomping on their way to the pencil sharpener for the 4th time when they're supposed to be doing a task. All of those subtle things I call, that's your smoke detector going off, telling you as a teacher, this kid wasn't ready for what I asked him to do, and I need to end this activity before I completely lose him and move back and fill in some gaps. You also need to really be able to support kids in taking risks and encourage questions, and be just as encouraging to your students who are raising their hand to ask a question as those who are raising their hand to answer the question correctly, so that you're really teaching kids that I value you taking a risk and asking a question as much or more than I value you knowing the right answer already, because that's a critical part of the instructional relationship. And then end at a point where kids are still feeling successful, or at least not ready to blow their stack, so that they come the next day and are ready to engage with you again. So this is where we get into your next tool, which is that gradual release of responsibility. And this is not a term that I made up. You can look it up on the internet. It's been around for a long, long time. It's a basic part of teaching pedagogy. But again, it might be something that you just haven't given more thought to lately. Now, I guarantee every single one of you is probably doing this, at least sometimes. But again, sometimes I think just bringing more intention to it can make it more powerful if you're doing it more regularly and with more intention. So that gradual release of responsibility is what we often refer to as I do, we do, you do, and then you do by yourself. Okay. So nothing new here. This is not magic fairy dust, but it's incredibly important. So that I do is when the teacher models it. We do is when the large group tries it themselves. You do is when small groups or partners practice it while I walk around as the teacher and give some feedback. And then you do by yourself, which is the individual child doing it independently or independent practice. So depending on the era in which you were received your teacher training, you might have heard of this as, direct instruction, guided practice, independent practice, or you might have heard of it as gradual release of responsibility. You might have heard of it as I do, we do, you do. Regardless, it's all the same concept. And looky here, it is a scaffolding technique. And that's exactly what they're representing on this slide, is it's getting that child up to the independent level. So one of the strategies that we briefly talked about, I'm going to go into a little more detail here, is visual supports. And I talked about how important it is because visuals remain after the instruction has left the building, okay? Elvis has left the building. So when our instruction ends, if we haven't provided some kind of a visual support, kids who have difficulty with executive function, for instance, might have a hard time pulling that information back in when they need it again. They don't have to if they've got it on a visual. Kids with short-term memory issues or difficulty pulling something from short-term into long-term benefit from visual supports. Kids who have distractibility benefit from visual supports. Most of us, all of us, benefit from visual supports. There's not one of us who doesn't use visual supports in our daily life, whether it's checklists to keep track of what we have to do, whether it's our lesson planning, whether it's a journal that we write our goals and our gratitudes in, whether it's a graphic organizer we use to tackle a research paper in our graduate class. We all use visual supports because they're really one of the most well-researched, proven strategies to impact behavior and academic achievement. So examples would be graphic organizers that help the child know what to listen for in notes or know what key terms to look for in a text that they're reading, or checklists to keep track of the order in which I'm going to do something or the steps in a task. Contracts where I know what I have to do to earn a particular privilege. Menus where I have options of things to choose from to demonstrate my knowledge. Examples and non-examples so that I can compare my final product to what it's supposed to look like and where it could go wrong, and monitor my own performance. Even motivational messages on the walls, putting expectations or behavioral rules on the walls, using sketch notes to help kids link concepts with a visual image, any kind of diagrams. The more you use visuals in your classroom, the more you are guaranteed to help kids be able to comprehend, express, and apply information as you give it to them. There's even research that says if you have put the steps to solving a problem on a visual that has remained in the same location on your wall the entire school year, you have to take it down during a standardized test. There's research that shows kids will look up at that spot on the wall and be able to recall those steps better to apply, even when the visual is gone. Very, very powerful stuff. Another strategy, scaffolding strategy that we want to remind ourselves to use regularly is prompting and cueing. Now, again, this is like, okay, Lisa, tell us something we don't know here. Of course, we know that we have to give prompts and reminders and cues to kids. But again, sometimes we forget that there's a hierarchy to that, and we can use it intentionally. That for some kids, we may have to start with a physical, actually demonstrating something to them hand over hand, or doing it for them, or helping them do it physically. The next step up would be modeling it for them and showing them an example, not the exact same thing, but an example of how to do it on the board. Visual, meaning I've provided a visual of an example or a checklist of what to do. Gestural, meaning maybe I'm giving them a cue, like a thumbs up, a thumbs down. Gestural would refer to that kind of thing. And then verbal being an actual verbal cue or reminder that I'm giving. And again, I just think sometimes we forget how important that is, and that when we're new with a skill, we may need, as learners, more of that specific, intense prompting, cueing, modeling than when we get more independent. Again, that's why it's called a scaffolding strategy, that we, in the beginning of learning a new skill, we have to start more at that foundational level of the prompting hierarchy. And as the child grows in their skills, we're getting to where all we may need to do is a verbal reminder of something to do. And we'll have to give less cues less often. So just keep in mind that that's another scaffolding strategy to keep in your toolbox all the time. We talked a little about think alouds and how important that is. So letting kids eavesdrop on your thought process is modeling your cognition. And we know that kids need to become metacognitive in their approach to learning to be really highly skilled and independent learners. So you want to model for them how you think about the content you're instructing on. What do I already know about this? What do I think I'm going to learn? Let's do just an understanding check. Make sure that I understand this. What am I picturing when I read that? What do I picture? And actually verbalizing that. So when I'm thinking about this, what is the most important thing I need to remember? How does this fit in with what I've learned and experienced before? So that's an opportunity for you to give kids a window into a competent, independent learner yourself. And show them, because you're still learning, show them how you approach a new task in your own thinking. That's a really valuable opportunity. Sometimes we want to be able to just use gestures and cues that keep the kids engaged and getting feedback without stopping the bus, okay? And that's when gestures and cues can come in handy in the classroom. So things like having the kids do a thumbs up, thumbs down, or I'm not sure is a really simple strategy. It's a formative assessment tool. It's also an example of a gesture and a cue. You can use that to get information from the kids, such as thumbs up, thumbs down, I'm not sure. Or you can use it to communicate your own expectations to students. So, I always had the silent coyote in my class. This was to remind kids that instead of doing this, we need to do this, and stop and listen. Now, I was an elementary age teacher, but I've used it with high school kids when I've been presenting to them, and they think it's funny. It's just something that is a visual that we can all relate to and remember an expectation very instantaneously. A give me five if I need to go to if I'm trying to get kids' attention, and it's reminding them to give me your ears, your eyes, sit still, look at the teacher, whatever you've decided your five are. The thumbs up, thumbs down, not sure, the listen. Those are all just examples of gestures and cues that we use almost intuitively as teachers. But again, when we bring intention to it, then we get to the point where we can go, I have a particular issue in my class that I find myself saying constantly. How could I bring a gesture to that so that I'm not constantly, so my silent coyote developed because I had seen a teacher do it. And I hate the constant shh, shh, shh. It drives me crazy when I'm saying that. So that's why I use that a lot, because it was just a better way to get the kids to be quiet without me constantly talking over them or shushing them. But you might have an issue. For instance, maybe you have trouble with the kids being quiet when they transition from group to group. So you might come up with a gesture for that to remind kids of the expectations of that. Maybe there's 3 rules that you want them to follow when they transition. So bring some intentionality into how you use those nonverbal gestures and cues to make your room function better. Because the reality is, as we mentioned early in this, a differentiated classroom doesn't look the same, doesn't function the same, is not managed the same way as a traditional classroom where everyone's learning the same thing at the same time. So you're going to have to come up with what works for you to manage that. So graphic organizers, we talked about how important they are. Most of us use them. They're visual displays of key information, things like concept maps, sequence flow charts, compare and contrast diagrams, cause and effect, main idea and details, Venn diagrams, T-charts, KWLs, whatever you want to use, main idea fish, 5 key concepts, whatever you want to use, you can find a bazillion free graphic organizers online. And again, I want you to remember that this is good for every age, every subject area, every level of learner. So when in doubt, if you're trying to help your kids perform better, include a graphic organizer in what you're teaching. Another thing that I think sometimes we really don't give enough attention to is building background knowledge, because our kids don't all come into the classroom. Our kids don't show up for the first T-ball lesson, with T-ball practice with the same background. having, and just like I talked about, kids come, with different physical skill abilities. Kids come with different family structures. Some have, a dad that's played baseball or a mom that played softball all the way through high school, and they've been tossing the ball around in the backyard since they were 2. And other kids have never put a mitt on their hand. So you cannot start that lesson at the same place for kids who have different degrees of experience and background. So some tools for building background knowledge are things like, a 10-minute virtual field trip to someplace that's going to give kids that level playing field in terms of whether they've ever seen a zoo before, or whether they've ever seen the planets modeled. Sensory experiences, getting their hands on things, guest speakers, doing cross-curricular units so that we all know we're going to be primed for the same information because we're reading about it in a novel in English, so we're ready for it in social studies. Picture books, YouTube videos, cross-genre themes, or peer mentors even. Students as teachers to do deep dives on a particular topic of interest and then share that information with other students. Having the students do interviews, doing jigsaw activities where each group becomes an expert on a different topic and then regroups with members of each group in a new group to teach each other. Those are great ways to build background knowledge and let kids pursue their own interests and areas of expertise, but then share them with others so that we all gain the benefit from each other's experiences. Another thing that hopefully you're already doing a lot of, and I do see this used more in classes probably than any other scaffolding strategy, is the partner talk or partner practice. That's something you might want to keep in mind, that there's a lot of different ways to do that. But some things that you want to keep in mind are, you might want to use it for a warm-up to review what we learned yesterday. So I don't see that used very often. And yet that's a great way to build positive momentum, to start a lesson by talking with a partner about what's one thing you learned from our lesson yesterday before you begin. Or maybe doing a problem together with a partner before we start today's learning activity. You want to use it during the lesson occasionally to process information. There's kind of a general rule of 10 by 2 that I shouldn't be talking. If I'm teaching a lesson in person with people, I shouldn't be teaching more than 10 minutes or presenting more than 10 minutes before I give at least 2 minutes for some kind of partner processing or asking questions or some kind of an activity to engage the learners. Maybe at the end of a lesson to help consolidate or provide a quick review of information, or as just a formative assessment to get a read on their understanding. So that's a great time for you to walk around and listen to the conversations that are happening and knowing whether you need to re-hit a concept or not. Another scaffolding strategy that I don't see used a lot, but it's really powerful, is to pre-teach the vocabulary that's going to be needed for a particular lesson. And that could be just for certain groups of kids that you think are going to need that, or it might based on your formative assessment, or it could be to the whole class. And I always encourage people, if there's something that you think might benefit everyone, do it for everyone, especially if it's quick and easy. Then that's kind of a universal design strategy, is to pre-teach the vocabulary that's going to be needed. Almost every student in the class is going to benefit from that. So explicitly teaching and presenting each potentially unknown word, using vocabulary maps, using word walls. One of the easy formative assessment things you can do to decide how much of the vocabulary you need to explicitly teach is to just have the key terminology from your lesson written on the board, and having kids do a thumbs up, thumbs down, not sure, for each of the words. Takes 30 seconds to do that, and it gives you an idea of which ones you need to make sure you explicitly teach. If you want to go into a little more effort on that, you could do a Quizlet or a Kahoot to find out how many kids know the terms that you're going to be using in that class lesson. Also, just thinking in terms of more intentionally using questioning strategies so that so one of the things that I used to do, and this was an idea I got from another teacher, this wasn't something I made up, but as a teacher, one of my issues that I felt like when I reflected on my own effectiveness, I felt like I needed to do better at offering different kinds of questions, more challenging questions. And so I put different question words from Bloom's taxonomy on popsicle sticks in a jar. And so when I would call on someone, I would pull a popsicle stick for the student, and then I would pull a popsicle stick for myself with a question word and challenge myself to frame that question up with that question word, like give me an example or compare or evaluate or that kind of thing. So planning different levels of questions so that you're challenging yourself to challenge your students. Also just giving sufficient think time. This is something we all know, and yet we all fall into the habit of asking a question, the child doesn't answer it right away, and we immediately call on someone else before the child has really even had time to think. So keep in mind, some kids need more think time than others. Also remember to reinforce, use questioning strategies to reinforce concepts that you want the kids to make sure they get. Also to refocus or reframe an issue or a situation, to probe a little deeper and really get kids to go that next level in thinking about something, and ask guiding questions. So rather than just go on to the next student when a student doesn't have the right answer, learn how to reframe it, learn how to find that nugget of you're on the right track and guide them to the right answer, rather than just say, because when you just call on another student or say, can you ask a friend, call on a friend to answer it instead, you've basically communicated to that child that you just don't get it and oh well. When really learning is about taking the nugget that you've got and leading you to the right answer. So that's that's the power of the questioning strategies. I do want to share briefly with you just the resources and read a little bit more that where I got a lot of these ideas, and where you can go extend them a little bit. So some of these are where I got an idea or enhanced an idea, and others are just things that I looked up that I know this is a kind of a drink of water with a fire hose on some of these differentiation strategies. So these are places where you could go to get a little more, dig a little deeper, dive a little deeper into some of those strategies. So make sure that you do take time, if you're interested in learning more about that. These would be good websites for you to go to. And so once you get a copy of this handout or this presentation, you can click to those or copy and paste and read a little bit more about some of those strategies. I'm hoping that this gave you some good reminders. Again, I don't think today that I probably told you anything you haven't heard before, but I know as a teacher, even when I give this presentation, it reminds me of some things that when I'm presenting, when I'm teaching my classes at college level, that I need to do more often. And so keep referring back to those and making sure that you are purposely and intentionally incorporating some of those scaffolding strategies within your instructional planning. And again, just to review some of those very basic principles, okay? Make sure that you're doing formative assessment. That's what it's all based on. If you're not checking in regularly with your kids, you have no basis for differentiating your instruction. Once you have checked in and done that formative assessment, you can create flexible groups. And from those flexible groups, you can use the scaffolding strategies to build positive momentum and get your kids in the right Goldilocks zone with those specific strategies that we talked about. I hope that if you have any questions, you'll contact me and get a hold of me. I love to brainstorm solutions with teachers. There's nothing that makes me happier than hearing feedback from someone emailing me and saying, this really intrigued me, but I didn't quite understand it. Can you give me an example? I tried this and it didn't work. Can you help me problem solve? So if you want to contact me, please visit www.combseducationalconsulting.com. There's a contact button, and I really look forward to hearing from you about how you're using the concepts from today's PD. And I hope you have a wonderful day.